All right, welcome to Module 8. This is Part 2, and we're going to start actually talking about petroleum products. Now, once again, if you have not watched the oil production video, please stop now and watch the crude oil production video so that you can see the different processes that allow to go into alkenes, alkanes, and alkynes, and how we break those down. And I'll just go through the terminology a little later in my slides, but you're going to need that video before we get too far started. So please take a moment, watch that video, and come back to this part 2. All right, so part 2, oils and natural gases. Basically, these are, once again, marine life, so organic matter that was rapidly buried. This is the liquid form or the gas form, the off-gas material that I can siphon off of the areas where liquid form. Now, a lot of the places where natural gas is occurring are also places where oil has occurred or once occurred, or we already extracted the oil and the natural gas is left, or the oil has been siphoned out completely and has all natural gas in that location. So they're kind of in a combination together, or we just kind of find natural gas alone. But we will never find oil without natural gas present, which is why we can do little burn-offs of the gas material when we're doing oil extraction. So one of the first ways that we can find oil is in an oil seep. This is where the liquid is actually coming to the surface of the earth. And oil seeps were a lot more common. They're becoming less common in the United States, but obviously that was what they were calling black gold back in the day. As far as formation of oil, there are certain rock formations that we're looking for. We're looking for past marine sediments, so not igneous or metamorphic rock, going back to your early earth sciences. We're looking for sedimentary rock, specifically sedimentary rock that was once in a marine environment, a water environment. Inland seas, once again. Petroleum traps are areas where the metamorphosed material or some type of anticline or syncline has occurred and allows us to create a trap in the rock. And so right here we have a little bend in the rock layer, and that allowed us to have capped oil in the material. Here is another one where we have a fault line, and the fault shifted up and allowed us to have an oil and gas trap in the rock. And then this one is an oil and gas trap which has been metamorphosed slightly. So it's a stratigraphic trap. Concentration of oil are based on 3 simple structural things. We're looking for fault lines, anticlines, and sometimes salt domes. Salt domes mean that I was in a marine environment, right? So I have a sedimentary layer of salted rock, like a gypsum. As far as how we like to recover, we do a drilling, and we then take the pressure off. We will then send down into the drill hole a slurry. The slurry is mostly water, but it's a mix of other propellant-like materials, like sands, and a whole mix of chemicals. And this is where that fracking debate comes in. Fracking is in a abundance of different chemical materials, and while they're minute in the water supply that's going into the earth, we are sending them down there into the rock layers, not exactly sure where they're going, to help break down the rock layer and create pressure to push the oil and natural gas up. As far as oil distribution, you can see in the pink some of our marine oil reserves and places where you can find some oil in the earth. As far as history, specifically in the USA, the first oil drilling rig was in Canada. Edwin Drake is the first person to do an oil drilling in the United States. He did it in Titusville, Pennsylvania, so that was our first oil spurt in Pennsylvania. The most abundant oil well in the world for many, many years, a good 50 solid years, was Spindletop in Texas, which is why Texas was known as the oil state. And just keywords, petroleum, petro, and oleum is oil. So petro rock, oil. So we're saying rock oil when we say petroleum. As far as recovery of materials, the bits and tools used for the companies have gotten more and more complex. And one of the things to keep in mind with oil extraction is that they are considered trade secrets. So while we have a good understanding of how some of this is done, a lot of it is still under trade secret, and therefore we cannot know exactly how all of these bits and pieces are being done, and no one welling company does it the same or exactly the same. Well, they're done similar too. And so these are some of the early models of oil welling. And you can see we have our derrick that allows us to hold the structure still as we put down our drill bit and punch our well. Once we have our well punched, we can then send our fluid down to create pressure. The pressure then pushes the oil up and out, or the natural gas up and out of the system. Here is a tricon bit for an early drilling well. Here is a small mom and pop shop natural gas well system. As far as oil recovery, there is the first level of oil recovery. So this is our first level, oil recovery. And then there's secondary levels of oil recovery. If it's worth it, which nowadays it is because oil prices are so high, it makes sense to do secondary. So back 50, not even 25 years ago, oil prices weren't that high, and therefore when we would send down for oil, once we were done extracting the easy to get out and the standard methods, we would just leave it. We would just leave and go on to the next well recovery system. But now that oil is becoming a less common commodity, and we also are able to pay higher prices for it, it makes sense to do secondary recovery. And so secondary recovery methods is the water injection. This goes back to the fracking fluid that can be sent down into the earth. There is a gas re-injection method where I actually use the natural gas that's coming up and I push it back down into the earth to create more pressure to break up the rock at a greater rate and get out the oil. Another one is steam flooding. Steam flooding is something that we will use in locations that would also be a great candidate for tar sands, which is a tertiary. So I'm getting there, tar sands. And then fire flooding, where I will actually set the well line on fire. And that's because there isn't a lot of oil left, but I'm trying to pressurize the natural gas out. And then finally is a chemical flooding, which is not technically legal in the United States. We're allowed to send down a water injection with a fracking fluid, but we are not allowed to do a chemical flooding. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in other parts of the world. So tertiary oil mining is the tertiary form, and this is tar sands. This is where I will take the tar out of the sand. So I will take the sand and I will pulverize it down, and then I will heat it up to the point where the liquids, the liquid oil or the slurry tar-like oil material will actually turn to a gas, and then I recollect it and condense it back into an oil, and I end up with the liquid in a separate holding. And this has only become economically viable because oil is able to pay those rates. But up until even 10 years ago, tar sands were not something that we would have spent our money on, so it's a fairly new practice. Tar sand extraction. As far as other forms, obviously the easy to get at oil is now becoming oil offshore. The stuff that's under land is no longer as viable or usable. And so now we've gotten into these offshore drillings, and these are modern marvel feats. These things are actually floating drilling pedestals that are not, they're anchored slightly, but they're actually kept in place based on satellites, which are constantly relaying the data that's making the ships, which have a multi-hovering ability that allows them to go right and left and constantly stay directly over the location that they need to be to keep their welling line in place. And so these offshore drilling platforms are just monsters in modern technology. Here's a picture of a little tar sands again, and then finally pipelines. And you can see that there are many, many pipelines in the United States. Just take a minute, soak all this information in, and then I will pick you up with a part 3 to start talking about how we refine crude oils, again, just a review of terms, and finally, like what do we put these oils into?